Hey everybody, it's Cameron, Stefan, and me, and we're doing our midweek lectionary psalm reflection once again. I think I can speak for all of us that this has been really fun for all of us, and we're enjoying it too, kind of diving deeper into a psalm and then finding the connections between that psalm and then whatever's happening on a Sunday morning. And didn't we hear from somebody, Stefan, that, especially last week, Psalm 16, and then I think it got read again on
Yeah,
Sunday.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of like usually if you just hear some random psalm on Sunday morning, you just kind of get the surface of it. But if you've spent a few days thinking about it, did a little research in it a few days before, it's like, oh yeah, that psalm. And yeah, so we've had a few folks say, like, oh yeah, it feels like it goes a little bit deeper on Sunday morning then because of that, which is great.
Yeah, which I love. Yeah.
Yeah,
And then, too, these lectionary psalms are uh, seasonal. So obviously, the people who created the lectionary are picking certain psalms that tie to the Easter season. So you're going to see kind of themes of being rescued or being saved, or God doing marvelous things.
hmm,
Or, for instance, in our psalm today, how could we repay God for all that He's done? So I'm going to do a little intro, but first, how about we have Stefan read, what is it, Psalm 116, 1 through 4,
yep,
and 12 through 19.
yep. All right, here we go. I love the Lord, for he heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy. Because he turned his ear to me, I will call on him as long as I live. The cords of death entangled me. The anguish of the grave came over me. I was overcome by distress and sorrow. Then I called on the name of the Lord. Lord, save me. What shall I return to the Lord for all his goodness to me? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. Truly I am your servant, Lord. I serve you just as my mother did. You have freed me from my chains. I will sacrifice a thank offering to you and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the house of the Lord, in your midst, Jerusalem. Praise the Lord.
Okay, that's a good reading there. So let me just say a couple words about Psalm 116. I did a bunch of research this past week, last few days, reading about Psalm 116. And I think that one of the first things to note about the Psalm is it starts out with this very beautiful and sincere declaration from the psalmist, which is, I love the Lord, which is so, it's almost like you would hear that today in a contemporary church. Like that's how we talk about our faith. Someone might say, I love the Lord. But in fact, it's kind of a rare statement to hear in the Psalms. We get a sense in the Psalms in general that the psalmist loves the Lord, but the psalmist never says it as directly and simply as we get it here in Psalm 116. It just starts out, I love the Lord. And I think there's just something really beautiful about that.
Yeah.
Um, and that's kind of, in its most distilled form, that's what we really hope for people as pastors, as ministry leaders, that they get to this place where they can just sincerely and honestly say, it's a declaration of faith, I love the Lord.
Mm.
And there was a few weeks ago when an elder and I went to go visit an older gentleman who's homebound, and he's pretty old. He can't hear very well. And we prayed together. We had communion together. We talked about church. He doesn't go to church anymore because he can't. But, anyways, towards the end of our meeting together, he almost like just spontaneously started giving a testimony
Mm.
and started talking. And one of the things he said was, uh, I love the Lord.
Mm.
He says, I love Jesus. I love Jesus so much.
Mm.
And he wasn't trying to be pious. He wasn't trying to impress me as a pastor. It was just really coming from his heart. And this man had a deep felt love of Jesus.
Mm.
And that's what you see here in the Psalm, this sincere declaration. And it's rare.
Mm.
But it's also beautiful, and it's something to kind of emulate or look up to. And then one commentator I read, he said this. He said you could sum up the psalm like this. You could give it a simple title such as "Why I Love God and How I Demonstrate That Love with My Life."
Mm.
And that's another way to that's another kind of access point into the psalm.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, if you ask somebody to summarize the psalm, what's the psalm all about? Well, why I love God and how I demonstrate that love in my life.
Mm. Yeah, a big theme that keeps popping out in the psalm, it's a little bit repetitive even, is how do I go public with this?
Yeah.
Like, where do I stand up and what do I say to the world? To profess my love. It's like, how do I hold the boombox over my head, beneath my crush's window, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, how do I make this really, really known? And so I'm studying for the sermon text, of course, right now, and that's in 1 Peter 1. And what's really coming out there, which of course this matches as a lectionary text, is like this public faith. Like, what does it mean to have a public faith? What does it mean to say, yep, Jesus follower? And then what should be expected of us because of that?
Yeah. Let me just build on that a little bit, because in verse 1 and verse 2, it really paints this picture of God who's present, who's active, who's listening, who's responding. Because quite quickly, the psalmist says, I love the Lord. And then he says, why? Mm-hmm. He heard my cry for mercy. He turned his ear to me. And then the psalmist begins to paint a picture in verse 3 and 4 is like, things aren't going well. We don't know exactly what's happening, but the psalmist is in trouble. The psalmist is struggling. The psalmist is near death. But yeah, and then it says too that, and then God rescues. So God turns his ear to the psalmist to rescue. And he says that, God saved me. Verse 4 says, then I called on the name of the Lord. Lord, save me. And the Lord does save the psalmist. And so then the psalmist then turns to this sense of like, how do I respond to the goodness of God? And so, Stephanie, you're just talking about going public. Mm-hmm. And verse 13 and 14, the psalmist plans to go public in response. And he does so in 3 ways. He says, I will lift the cup of salvation. I will call on the name of the Lord, and I will fulfill my vows in the presence of all his people.
Sounds like you get a sermon of 3 points there, Sam.
You want me to do the sermon for this week?
You know what? It's all yours.
So again, this isn't like sometimes we think it's a private faith, like I love the Lord, and that's a personal, private sentiment. And it can be that, but it needs to be lived out publicly. Mm-hmm. It needs to find expression outwardly. Mm-hmm. And the psalmist says that I'm gonna respond to the goodness of God in a public kind of way. Mm-hmm. And he's gonna do these 3 things. I'm gonna lift, I'm gonna call, and I'm gonna fulfill my vows. And then in verse 17, it gets repeated, but instead of lifting up the cup of salvation, the psalmist says, I will sacrifice a thank offering to you. And so really the psalm becomes all about, how do we live a life of gratitude in response to what God has done for us? And we can never repay God for all the goodness that he's shown us. And especially in response to Easter, Jesus rising from the dead and the work that Jesus does on the cross and in the garden tomb. For our sake, we get linked into Jesus, and somehow we benefit from his life, death, and resurrection. I mean, how could we ever pay back God for that? And so the psalmist is wondering too, like, how do I respond to God's goodness? And the psalmist in verse 17 says, I will sacrifice a thank offering to you.
Mm.
And so then in the following verses, the 8 verses of Thanksgiving, which is really 12 through 19, the Lord, I don't know if you noticed this, but the Lord, Yahweh, is the word, but it gets translated the Lord, is mentioned 9 times. So it becomes very obvious that like the one that we give thanks to, the one who gets all the credit is Yahweh,
Mm.
the Lord.
Mm.
Yeah, I was struck by the tenses. So you have this, this very present statement, I love the Lord, present tense. And then you have a group of past tense, because I was overcome by trouble and sorrow. I called on the name of the Lord and he saved me. And then you have this future, and then what are you going, and then it leads to action. I will do this. I will do this. I will do this. And I guess I was just really struck at sort of just yeah, living that gap between the knowledge of where you are in the presence, your present reality of not being able to escape from the love of God, being in a place of thanksgiving. What are you going to do in the future about it, and how are you going to recall your past and what God did for you?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I almost feel like this season and the mystery of Easter is sort of the reality of past, present, and future. Theologically, I guess, is that we're celebrating Easter, and we're sort of living into the past, where this event that happened, but then we also sort of look forward to the second coming, but then we're also in the present state of praising God for his current goodness in our lives.
Hmm.
And I think particularly in a time where we're sort of stuck at home, my brain often goes to the future. When is this thing going to end? Mm-hmm. And so I guess your whole opening, it's kind of like, if we can just be in this present place of just saying, I love the Lord, there's like not much more we need to say, It's like, game over, end of song. Let's move on. Let's just like sit there for a while in that present place.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. That's a great reflection.
It's almost like, as I think about like 2 applications, one is that you could use Psalm 116 as a basic guide to prayer. So, anyone listening to this video today, see if you can like spend a few moments quietly today and see if you can get in touch with that love of God, that love that you have for God. And I wonder if you could even say to God, Lord, I love you. And say it from that very sincere place. And then spend some time recalling the goodness that the Lord has shown you. Think back over your life. Think about how God has been present. Think about all that God has done. And then naturally flowing out of that is, you could feel almost a response bubbling up. Like, how can I show God how grateful I am for all that he's done for me? And so you get a sense of like, I need to respond to this goodness that I've been shown. So I think that's one, is that it can guide us in prayer, and it's a very simple format. Find a way to say your own confession. I love you, Lord. Think about all that God's done for you, and then find a way to respond to that. But the other thing too is we almost saw Psalm 116 kind of lived out in our very presence a month ago, 2 months ago, when Renee Brookhuizen got up in front of church and she made her public profession of faith. And if you look at Psalm 116, it's almost like we saw Psalm 116 alive today in Renee's profession. I mean, a public profession of faith is essentially like, I love you, Lord. That's essentially what she's doing in front of the whole congregation. She's saying, I love you, Jesus. And then she kind of talked about some trouble that she was having in her life and how God was involved in the midst of that. And then part of the public profession of faith is some sort of declaration that I want to live for God the rest of my days. I want to respond in gratitude for all that God has done for me. I want to live for him, which is essentially what she said in her profession of faith. So it's kind of interesting. I never thought of Psalm 116 as kind of a guide for public profession of faith, but it's kind of all in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I found when I read verse 15, I stopped and I thought, whoa, that's interesting. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. I thought, what an interesting and also really beautiful idea that is. Like that the maybe I'm thinking this way because I'm gonna do a funeral in 2 days, but precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. That there's something precious about the death of a child, of one of his children. I just kind of imagine God being moved at the death of Ethel Lucas, who will be laid to rest in a couple of days. And then right after that, there's something just as intimate and beautiful in verse 16. Truly, I am your servant, Lord. I serve you just as my mother did. And there's this sense of like, God, you know my mom, right? Remember her? Remember my mom? Isn't she great? I want to serve you just like she did. It's this really intimate, personal.
Yeah.
So there's this idea of the public, like I will stand and I will make my vow and I'll be very public about it. And also it's like, remember my mom? She loved you too. She really loved you. I want to love you like she loved you. I just think that's delightful.
Devin, that's a sermon right there.
Yeah, right? We've got 3 of them now this week.
Yeah, it's funny, like, these Psalms are so rich and it doesn't really take much. You just start kind of diving into them a little bit, thinking about them.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, there's all this richness in the Psalms. It's no wonder that the Psalms are called the prayer book of God's people.
Mm.
It's like so often we don't know what to pray. We don't know how to pray. But the Psalms are there to kind of give us words and to give us structure. I think God knows that we just run out of creative, original things to say. And I think that's all right. We can lean on the Psalms to kind of guide us and teach us.
Mm-hmm. And we've kind of done that the last few weeks too. Like when we were in Lent, the plan throughout Lent, even before the pandemic really hit us, the plan was to do the lectionary psalm each week. And then when we all got stuck in our houses, we kept doing the lectionary psalm each week. And then it turned to Easter and we thought, well, let's keep doing the psalm each week. And let's stay in the prayer book of God's people. And so each week in our worship service, we're just continuing to go back to that same well because it continues to feed us.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that might be one of the takeaways that Alger Park worship has from this, is like, we got to stay in the Psalms.
Mm.
Yeah, this week I chose a strange sort of setting. It's called I Will Walk in the Presence of God, again from the Psalm of the Seasons book. And I think it cues into the ideas of past, present, future, because I will walk in the presence of God. And then it said, I trusted you when I was afflicted. I'm not sure, there's present tense in here as well, but I actually set this psalm about 12 years ago on one of my first, I guess, records, you can call it that. When you're looking at the back catalog, you're always embarrassed. But I said like a polka style beat in 3. It's I love the Lord. Da, da, da. I have no idea if it's any good anymore. I kind of don't want to take a look at it. But the setting that we did this week, I love walking songs, and I think it's you talk about having sort of a structure for prayer. I think there's also sort of different physical ways that we can pray. It's not always the traditional like at the bedside with your hands folded sort of situations. But I always feel like we just sang I want Jesus to walk with me on Good Friday, and this is I will walk in the presence of God. And I just thought that was just a really cool sort of way to set this psalm. And I always feel like too, whenever I hear one of these sort of walking songs that has sort of this trudging walking tempo, I don't know why, I always hear Johnny Cash in my head. So as I'm singing I will walk in the presence of God, I'm just like hearing the voice of Johnny Cash.
Awesome.
living out his days, you know. But yeah, that's an aside. But I think yeah, I think sort of bringing back, you know, a lot of these psalms, and at least the spirit of the psalms and worship, once we can worship together again, I think will be really profound.
Awesome.
That's great. On a side note, I just wrote a blog for Friday's blog post. It's called Walking with Jesus,
Oh, cool.
and it's
There we
about it's an Easter practice that I'm proposing to the congregation. That walking is actually the pace of discipleship.
Hmm.
So I don't know if there's a theme here. Walking sounds like maybe
Yeah.
walking is the theme for the week.
Yeah, I walk the line, right? Yep.
There you go. Because you're mine.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to the song, Cameron,
Yeah.
and I think that's probably it for today. Should we sign off?
Yep. Have a good day, everybody.
There
All
you go.
right, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
I will walk in the presence of God. I trusted when I was afflicted. I walk in the sight of the Lord. And even in the face of death, I will walk in the presence of God. I will walk in the presence of God. Your servant, Lord, is ever trusting. My bonds you have loosened with care. I offer thanks and sacrifice. I will walk in the presence of God. I will walk in the presence of God. My vows to God I keep with gladness. I dwell in the house of the Lord. My promises I will fulfill. I will walk in the presence of God. I will